Survive alone, brat. My father's voice, a gravelly baritone fueled by years of casual cruelty, a total absence of paternal instinct, and a growing impatience for anything that didn't serve his immediate ego, echoed through the vast clinical glass and steel terminal of Heathrow Airport. That taunt, accompanied by a sneer from my stepmother Linda, a woman whose beauty was a thin veneer over a soul of jagged edges, is something I can still feel like a physical burn on my skin even decades later. The final goodbye they offered wasn't a hug or a tearful wave. It was a cold, transactional dismissal. They dumped a measly $2 on 11-year-old me, crinkled pathetic bills that smelled of stale tobacco, old regrets, and the cheap cologne Robert used to mask his failures before boarding a flight back to Chicago without a second glance. It was more than just a departure. It was a cold, calculated betrayal that stripped away my childhood in the span of a single terminal announcement. I stood there, a small shivering figure amidst a sea of indifferent travelers and rolling suitcases, clutching a backpack filled with useless trinkets, while they chose a life unburdened by the daughter of a woman Robert wanted to forget. The fluorescent lights overhead felt like searching interrogation lamps, exposing my vulnerability to every passerby. I was an object they had simply decided not to carry anymore, a piece of excess baggage discarded to avoid a fee. The terminal felt like a cathedral of abandonment. Every overhead announcement was a reminder of destinations I couldn't reach. Every happy family walking past with their coordinated luggage and protective parents was a mirror reflecting my own sudden worthlessness. The architecture of Heathrow, designed to move people toward their futures, seemed to conspire to keep me rooted in a terrifying present. For Robert, I wasn't a child to be protected, or a legacy to be cherished. I was a living evidence of his first mistake, a marriage to my mother that didn't provide the social climbing or the effortless wealth he so desperately craved. He looked at me and saw the ghost of a woman who had dared to expect more from him than he was capable of giving. My mother, Sarah, was a woman of quiet grace and old-world virtues, who had brought a modest inheritance and a heart full of hope to their union, only to see both systematically drained by Robert's pathological need for status, his wandering eye and his habitual gambling. She was the kind of person who believed in the inherent goodness of people, a trait Robert exploited with surgical precision until there was nothing left but hollow promises and empty accounts. When she died of a broken heart exacerbated by a lack of medical care he refused to fund, claiming it was too expensive, while he bought a new leather interior for his car, Robert didn't see a grieving daughter. He saw an administrative hurdle to his new life with Linda. Linda was a woman who treated cruelty like a high-fashion accessory, viewing me as a budget-line item to be cut in the balance sheet of their new, shallow existence. But they weren't laughing 20 years later. They didn't see the comedy when they returned from their self-imposed exile of debt and failure to find a multi-million-dollar lawsuit over child abandonment, and the shocking realization that I, the brat, owned the very roof over their heads. I stood in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan, a space that defined old-world opulence with its towering ceilings, gold leaf molding, and a history that looked down upon the desperate and the unrefined. The air was heavy with the scent of thousands of hand-cut white lilies and the rich, smoky undertones of 100-year-old Scotch smells that represented a world of permanence and power, a stark contrast to the fleeting trash-scented desperation of my childhood. From my vantage point near the orchestra, where the violins played a hauntingly beautiful Vivaldi, a piece about the shifting seasons of life, I watched my biological father and his wife stumble through the massive double doors, looking like lost tourists in their own nightmare. They looked like weathered ghosts of their former selves, a tragic, dusty contrast to the polished elite sipping Moët around them. Their clothes, which they once wore as armor for their vanity, now hung loosely on their shrinking, malnourished frames, the fabric frayed at the edges. Robert's suit was a decade out of style, the polyester sheen revealing his lack of status as clearly as a neon sign. Their faces were etched with the jagged, deep-seated lines of desperation that come from a decade of chasing phantom investments and fleeing a growing list of creditors across 3 continents. It was my 31st birthday gala, a high society event that represented the pinnacle of my ascent into the stratosphere of New York's legal and financial world, a world where I didn't just belong. I set the terms of engagement. The room was filled with power brokers, senators, hedge fund titans, and tech disruptors, the kind of people who wouldn't be caught dead in the same zip code as the bankrupt Vances if it weren't for the gold-embossed invitation bearing my name. They had crashed it with a mixture of delusion, sheer audacity, and a lingering hope that blood was thicker than the ice water in my veins. They expected the brat to still be seeking their approval, unaware that I had long ago replaced their ghost with my own iron will. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her throat in a theatrical gesture she'd always used to mimic high-class distress, a move that felt as hollow and rehearsed as her entire personality. She took in my custom-tailored silk gown, a deep emerald green that complemented the fire in my eyes and the icy resolve in my heart. She watched as the governor of New York laughed heartily at one of my sharp-witted jokes about international tax havens, a joke that Robert would never have understood, preoccupied as he was with the small-time scams of a professional grifter. "No, impossible," she hissed, her eyes darting around the room, performing a rapid-fire calculation of the room's net worth and searching for a weakness she could exploit just like she always did. I didn't break my stride, sipping my vintage champagne with a calm that had taken me 2 decades of agonizing self-discipline, late-night study sessions, and thousands of hours of therapy to perfect. I was no longer the girl shivering in Heathrow. I was the storm that had finally made landfall. I felt the weight of the legal documents my assistant Sarah was holding just 10 feet away. They were the final, irrevocable nails in a coffin I had been building since the day I realized no one was coming back for me in that London terminal. The ballroom was a sea of power players, men in bespoke Tom Ford suits, and women in couture that cost more than Robert's current life insurance policy. To Robert and Linda, I was still just the brat they had discarded like a piece of unwanted overweight luggage. They didn't realize that the little girl they left with $2 and a heart full of terror had grown up to become the apex predator in this social jungle. I had learned to hunt in the shadows, to analyze balance sheets like battle maps, and to anticipate a betrayal before the first word was spoken. Every cold glance I received in foster care had been a lesson in reading the room. Every night I went hungry was an exercise in sharpening my hunger for success. Tonight, the hunt was finally coming to an end, and I intended to savor every silent, crushing moment of it. That moment changed everything because for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't the victim. I was the architect of their impending ruin. I saw Robert straighten his tattered tie, clearing his throat, and attempting to put on that hollow, practiced, doting father act for the cameras that flashed nearby. He was blissfully unaware that I had spent the last 3 years meticulously buying up every cent of his debt through a complex web of shell companies. Every foreclosure notice, he'd arrogantly ignored every predatory loan he'd taken to keep Tyler in sports cars and flashy watches. I owned all of it. I was their bank, their creditor, and their inevitable judge. My legal team had spent months untangling the web of lies Robert had used to siphon off my mother's remaining trust, and we had the receipts, the witnesses, and the cold hard evidence of his larceny. I hadn't just gotten rich, I had become the owner of his failures. I leaned over to my husband Julian, a man whose family name was synonymous with Wall Street royalty, and who possessed a moral compass as steady as his investment portfolio. Julian wasn't just my husband. He was the man who had seen me at my most vulnerable during the nights when the airport nightmares returned, and I woke up gasping for air in a foreign city. He was the one who helped me sharpen my edge, teaching me that the best revenge isn't just winning, it's total erasure of the enemy's world. "The vultures have landed," I whispered, my voice as cold as the ice in my glass. Julian's grip on my waist tightened, his eyes flashing with a protective cold fire that matched my own. He knew the history. He'd seen the psychological scars that no amount of success could fully heal, the way I still checked the locks 3 times at night, or the way I tensed up whenever I heard a PA system announcement. He was ready to play his part in the final act of this long overdue justice. He knew I wouldn't stop until there was nothing left of them but the bitter, salt-soaked memory of their own cruelty. The memory of that day in Heathrow is a jagged shard of glass in my mind, a wound that never quite smoothed over despite the years of luxury that followed. We were supposed to be on a bonding vacation, a phrase Robert used to mask the reality that Linda just wanted to show off her new wardrobe in the boutiques of Paris and London. There was Robert projecting the image of the successful patriarch. Linda, his enabling co-conspirator, who viewed me as a budget line item to be cut. Their golden child son Tyler, who was encouraged to treat me like a servant. And me, the inconvenient reminder of a life Robert wanted to bury. I remember the cold, unforgiving plastic of the airport chairs, the smell of burnt coffee and jet fuel, and the way Tyler was licking a large neon green lollipop. He smirked at me holding his new Game Boy with the latest titles, a gift bought with money Robert claimed we didn't have for my basic school supplies or warm winter shoes. I was thirsty, tired, and terrified, sensing a shift in the atmosphere long before the actual blow fell. The way they exchanged glances, the hurried whispers behind their hands, it was all a prelude to the abandonment. They didn't even have the courage to tell me they were leaving. They just walked away, while I was looking at a plane taking off pretending I was on it. "We're going to get some magazines and snacks. Stay here with the bags, Emily," Linda had said, her voice dripping with a fake saccharine sweetness that usually preceded a lecture on my ingratitude. Then Robert reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 crumpled single-dollar bills, not even British pounds, just $2, that were functionally useless in a high-security London terminal, and tossed them into my lap. He laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering on a graveyard pavement devoid of any soul. "Survive alone, brat. Maybe the British will teach you the manners you're too stubborn to learn at home," he'd barked before they turned and walked toward the gates. I waited for 6 hours, clutching those $2 until the ink started to smudge from my sweat, and the terror became a dull, freezing ache. I watched the clock tick past their departure time, my heart sinking with every mechanical click of the airport display. I was an 11-year-old girl in a foreign country with no passport. They had safely tucked mine into Linda's designer purse and no way home. The isolation was absolute. I was a ghost in a terminal of thousands, a discarded piece of humanity. I began to realize then that the world was built on papers and permissions, things I no longer possessed. The next morning, after being found huddled and shivering behind a row of trash bins by a terminal janitor named Arthur, I knew my life as I knew it was over. Arthur was the first person in my life to show me genuine, selfless kindness without expecting anything in return. He gave me a warm cup of tea, his own woolen scarf, and called the authorities with a look of such profound pity that it stayed with me forever, serving as the fuel for my ambition. But the path from an abandoned child in a London precinct to a powerhouse in New York City was paved with more grit, blood, and tears than most people could imagine. After a harrowing month in the British foster system, where I learned to fight for my food and my space against kids twice my size, I was finally taken in by Eleanor, a distant relative of my mother's, who lived in a small, book-filled apartment in Boston. Eleanor didn't believe in pity. She believed in the transformative power of education and cold, hard logic as weapons of war. "If you want to survive, Emily," she'd tell me over bowls of thin vegetable soup and thick law textbooks that weighed more than I did, "you have to be 10 times smarter than the people who tried to break you. You have to be the one who writes the rules, not the one who follows them. Power isn't given in this world, Emily. It's seized by those who have nothing left to lose." While Tyler was being coddled through expensive private schools in Texas, failing his way upward because Robert still had enough crooked connections to buy his grades, I was working 3 jobs. I cleaned corporate offices at 4 a.m., waitressed at Greasy Spoons during the lunch rush, and tutored rich kids who had half my intellect but 10 times my resources in the evenings. I fought my way into Harvard Law not just as a student but as a force of nature. I spent my weekends at a 24-hour Starbucks studying the intricacies of inheritance law abandonment statutes and the complex web of corporate restructuring. I wasn't just building a career. I was building a sophisticated legal cage for the people who thought I was nothing. Every case study I read, every exam I aced was a brick in the wall of my future fortress. The psychological toll of that journey was immense. There were nights when the memory of my father's laugh felt like a physical weight on my chest, threatening to suffocate the ambition I had worked so hard to cultivate. I learned to use that pain as a catalyst. When a professor questioned my perspective, I didn't get angry. I got more precise. When a peer tried to use their social connections to bypass me, I worked twice as hard until I was the one making the connections they needed. I was a ghost in the library, a shadow in the courtroom, until I was the one sitting on the bench. I learned to mask my emotions so thoroughly that my face became an unreadable map of professional intent. My rise in the high-stakes legal world of Manhattan was meteoric, fueled by a silent, burning rage that I carefully disguised as professional excellence. I became a partner at Sterling and Hunt by 28. A feat that sent shockwaves through the old money circles of New York, where pedigree usually trumped performance. My reputation was built on a scorched earth policy in litigation. I didn't just win cases. I dismantled the opposition's very will to fight. I had a secret weapon. I knew how to navigate the shadows, because I had lived in them. I knew how to spot a lie, because I had been raised by the master of deception himself. It was during a grueling 3-month negotiation for a high-stakes merger involving a global logistics firm that I met Julian. He was the client, a billionaire tech mogul known for his icy exterior and brilliant mind. We didn't just fall in love. We formed a strategic alliance of souls who had both seen the darker side of human ambition. When I finally told him the truth about the $2 at Heathrow, he didn't offer me empty platitudes or generic "I'm so sorries." He looked at me with a terrifyingly calm expression, his eyes reflecting the flickering lights of the Manhattan skyline, and asked, "How do you want to destroy them? Because I will give you the world if it means you can tear theirs down." That was the moment I started the Brat project. This wasn't about a quick legal win or a petty public scene. It was about the total systemic demolition of their lives, their finances, and their dignity. I wanted them to wake up one day and realize that every breath they took, every morsel they ate, and every cent they spent was permitted by the daughter they discarded like trash. I spent years acquiring their debt, tracking their failed ventures, and waiting for the moment they were most vulnerable. I used Julian's vast resources and my own legal expertise to track them like a predator. They had moved to a flashy, oversized McMansion in a Nashville suburb, living a life of perceived luxury that was actually a house of cards, built on subprime loans and Robert's failing commercial real estate business. They had spent my mother's inheritance money that was legally protected in a trust that Robert had illegally tapped into through forged signatures, and crooked accountants on Tyler's string of failed tech startups, and Linda's endless cycle of rejuvenating plastic surgeries. I watched from the shadows as they grew more desperate, Robert's name appearing on private lists of delinquent taxpayers. I could have sued them then, but I wanted them to feel the same sense of total, sudden abandonment that I had felt. I wanted them to reach for a lifeline and find only my cold, indifferent hand pulling it away. The implications of my strategy were clear. I wasn't just taking their money, I was taking their identity. Robert Vance existed only because of his perceived wealth. Without it, he was just a shell of a man, a bully without a stick. Linda was even more fragile. Her entire existence was predicated on being seen as a woman of luxury. By systematically buying their world, I was effectively erasing them. I began purchasing their debt through a series of anonymous holding companies, eventually becoming their primary creditor. I owned the mortgage on their house, the notes on their cars, and even the high-interest lines of credit Tyler was using to fund his fake influencer lifestyle on borrowed yachts. They thought they were dealing with faceless corporate banks, but they were dealing with the girl they had left behind. The next morning, after the gala, I sent the first of the formal notices, a massive civil lawsuit for child abandonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and criminal misappropriation of my mother's estate. I timed it with surgical precision so they would receive the summons just 48 hours before my birthday gala, knowing their narcissism and their desperate need for a handout would drive them to show up and try to settle, privately, to save their social standing. Back at the gala, the confrontation was a masterpiece of social execution. Robert approached first, his face twisted into a grotesque, practiced mask of paternal pride that made my skin crawl with visceral revulsion. "Emily, sweetheart, look at you. We always knew you were a fighter, a true Vance." He boomed, his voice carrying through the quiet ballroom loud enough for a reporter from the Times to turn their head. He was trying to draft off my success to claim my resilience as a genetic inheritance, rather than a survival mechanism against him. I didn't move an inch. I pulled my hand back with deliberate slowness when he reached for it. "Mr. Vance?" I said, my voice as sharp and cold as a diamond cutter. "I don't believe we've been introduced. This is a private event for partners and associates of the firm." "Who invited you?" Linda pushed forward, then her eyes scanning my jewelry for its resale value with the practiced greed of a pawn shop owner. Her eyes were sunken, the Botox unable to hide the frantic terror behind them. "Oh, stop the theatrics, Emily. We're your parents. We've had a few rough years, some misunderstandings with the law, but we're here now to make things right. We can be a family again. Tyler is over there, he's so excited to see his big sister." I glanced past them to see Tyler hovering near the seafood tower, stuffing jumbo shrimp into his mouth with the same entitled greed he'd shown as a child, his clothes smelling of cheap cologne and desperation. He looked like a parody of the man he was supposed to be. "Family," I repeated the word, tasting like bitter ash and rusted iron in my mouth. The last time I saw my family, I was being traded for $2 and a one-way flight back to Chicago that didn't include me. "Tell me, Robert, did you get your money's worth? Was the magazine you bought worth the price of your only daughter's soul? Or did you spend it on a drink to toast your freedom from the brat?" The color drained from his face as several guests leaned in the silence around us, becoming heavy and judgmental. Julian stepped forward, then his presence imposing and lethal. "I believe the lady asked you to leave," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "And I believe your lawyers have already received the paperwork regarding the immediate foreclosure on your Nashville property. Since I own the company that holds your debt, I've decided to expedite the process. You have 48 hours to vacate. Perhaps you can find a shelter that takes $2 donations from its residents." Linda's jaw dropped, her "impossible" whispered again. But this time it was laced with the cold realization of total ruin. I leaned in close to her, smelling the desperate mix of high-end gin and the expensive perfume she used to mask her growing anxiety. "You told me to survive alone, Linda. I did. I survived the streets, the cold, and the hunger you ignored. And now I'm going to make sure you have to do the same. Let's see how much your golden son helps you when there's no trust fund left to drain and no yacht to hide on." I signaled to the security team, 4 large men who didn't look like they took no for an answer. As they were being escorted out, struggling and shouting about ingratitude and family loyalty in front of the very elite they so desperately wanted to join, I didn't feel a drop of guilt. I felt a profound, exhilarating sense of peace. The debt was finally settled in full, with 20 years of interest. The air in the room felt cleaner the moment they crossed the threshold. The consequences of their actions were now unavoidable. They had sowed seeds of neglect and cruelty, and tonight they were reaping the whirlwind. The aftermath was a glorious, calculated collapse that played out across the front pages of every major paper. The lawsuit I filed was a masterstroke of legal maneuvering, utilizing every obscure statute I had memorized during those long, lonely nights in Boston. I was able to freeze every one of their remaining assets as potential restitution for Robert's criminal mismanagement of my mother's estate. The discovery phase of the trial was a public nightmare for them. I leaked the details of their airport abandonment tactic to major news outlets, complete with the original police reports and the scanned image of the 2 wrinkled dollar bills I had kept as a grim souvenir. The story of the $2 heiress went viral, turning them into social pariahs. In the age of social media, being a child abandoner is a social death sentence more permanent than prison. People who had once tolerated Robert's shady deals suddenly found him toxic. Tyler's friends dropped him overnight. He went from VIP tables and champagne showers to sleeping in his 10-year-old car in less than a week. Robert tried to countersue, claiming I was unstable, but I had Eleanor. She appeared in court as a witness, her presence regal, unshakable, and terrifyingly articulate. She presented the testimony of the social workers who had found me starving, terrified, and clinging to 2 useless dollars. The judge, a woman who had seen her fair share of family rot, looked at Robert and Linda with pure, unmitigated disgust. We didn't just win, we dismantled them. They were ordered to pay back the entirety of the trust with 20 years of compounded interest, plus punitive damages for emotional trauma. By the time the dust settled, they were exactly what they had tried to make me: penniless, disgraced, and utterly alone in a world that had no use for them. I bought their Nashville home at auction, the very house they had used to exclude me from their perfect life, and turned it into a high-tech shelter for abandoned and runaway youth, naming it Eleanor's House. I made sure the national press was there when the sign went up, ensuring that every time Robert or Linda Googled their own names, they would see my face and the permanent, towering legacy of their failure as parents. I wanted the architectural proof of their cruelty to serve as a beacon for others who had been discarded. A year later, I was sitting on the terrace of our penthouse in San Francisco, looking out over the Golden Gate Bridge as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple. Julian was beside me. We were celebrating the opening of my new firm's West Coast office, which focused on child advocacy and probate law. I had spent my life running from that girl at the airport, but now I finally felt like I had caught up to her and given her the hug she deserved. I heard through a private investigator that Robert and Linda were living in a rusted trailer in rural Kentucky. Robert was working as a night security guard for a warehouse, a job that required him to stand for 12 hours a day in the cold, and Linda was cleaning motels for minimum wage, her designer clothes, replaced by stained uniforms. Tyler was reportedly bouncing between couches of friends who grew tired of him. Within days, his fame, long forgotten, his only remaining talent being the ability to complain about a world that no longer owed him a living. They had tried to call me once, a desperate, tearful message from Robert begging for a loan for Linda's medical bills after she fell. I didn't even listen to the whole thing. I simply deleted it and went back to my meeting. Some might call it cruel, but in my world it was just the closing of a contract. They had taught me how to survive alone, and I had simply mastered the lesson better than they ever could have imagined. I had learned that mercy is a privilege reserved for those who show it, and they had spent their lives showing none. The anger that had fueled me for 20 years had finally cooled into a solid, unbreakable foundation of self-worth. I was whole, I was powerful, and I was finally truly free from the weight of their judgment. We walked inside to join our real friends, people who had been in the trenches with us, for a Thanksgiving dinner, centered around gratitude and genuine connection rather than social climbing. I looked at the table filled with people who loved me for my mind, my resilience, and my heart. And I knew I had won the only game that mattered. The brat had not only survived, she had conquered the world that tried to discard her. I had used my skills, my rage, and the unwavering support of the people who actually cared for me to turn a tragedy into a global empire of justice. Julian and I were planning to start a real family built on a foundation of protection and love that Robert could never understand. My journey from that cold, hard airport floor was complete. I was the architect of my own light, and the shadows they tried to cast over me were long gone. Every night when I look at that framed $2 bill in my study placed right next to my Harvard Law degree, It doesn't remind me of what I lost or the pain I suffered. It reminds me of the transaction that bought my freedom and the incredible ROI on my own resilience. It reminds me that value isn't something someone gives you in a terminal or a ballroom. It's something you create from the wreckage of their expectations. My firm now handles cases for those the system ignored, providing the kind of legal sword and shield Eleanor taught me about. My legacy isn't the millions in the bank or the penthouse views. It's the fact that no child in my city will ever have to survive alone without a fighter in their corner. As I stepped out into the San Francisco morning, the air crisp and full of promise, I knew that the little girl from Heathrow was finally resting in peace, replaced by a woman who knew exactly what she was worth, and it was far, far more than $2. I had turned their curse into my greatest blessing, and as the fog rolled in over the bay, I felt a warmth that no designer coat could ever provide. I was Emily Vance, and I had survived everything. I was no longer the girl clutching crinkled bills. I was the woman who had redefined what it meant to win.